Welcome back. It's Andrew Eborn here in lockdown London, and delighted that yet again I'm going to be joined by George Weiss, Rainbow George, who'll be talking about his early life and also his time with Peter Cook. Don't go anywhere because I know you can't. I'll speak to you in a few minutes. Bye.
Hello.
George, hi. Thanks so much for joining me again. How are you doing?
Thank you.
Always a joy. Right. It would be fantastic to talk about some of that earlier stuff. I know, putting everybody in background. You've been using many different names throughout the years, playing around with all sorts of radio hosts and so on and so forth along the lines. What do you prefer to be called these days?
Rainbow George. Rainbow George is a name that was given to me by a Guardian journalist called Maeve Kennedy years ago. She used to do the diary in the Guardian, and she gave me a lot of coverage and called me Rainbow George. So that's the name.
And where did the Rainbow George come from?
Rainbow George is the only son of Leopold Weiss's 7 children. I have 6 sisters, 2 of them half sisters. My dad was in Vienna, and he was married, and his wife died in labour trying to give birth to a son, and Dad took his 2 daughters from that marriage to a nursery school where my mother was a teacher, and sort of met my mother and married her, and had 4 daughters, and his idiot son, me.
And your father was a diamond merchant, wasn't he, in Vienna?
Yes, diamonds and precious stones and second-hand jewellery, and very, wealthy man, but a sad man. He had a brother and 4 sisters. His brother was married. His 4 sisters weren't. They all died in the Holocaust. All of my dad's family died in the Holocaust, but my mother's family all survived it. And Dad was a close friend of a baker called Willie Raub, who was the grandson of Dominic Raub, and Willie Raub, he had a partner in his bakery who was my uncle Ferdinand Schwartz. So my mother had a sister called Erica. She married a Mr. Schwartz, which is black, and my mother married Mr. Weiss, which is white.
Oh, fantastic!
So anyway, my young days, I was very much a nature boy. Loved going out bird watching and stuff, and as I was when I was eight and a half years old, I was sent to boarding school, a school called Beaconsfield in Sussex, and Jewish school. Brian Epstein was there. in the early days of that school. It didn't last long, but I hated it.
Did you? Were you a contemporary of Brian Epstein?
Sorry?
Were you a contemporary of Brian's?
Was I?
Were you with at school at the same time as Brian?
I think he just left when I arrived there. But as I say, I hated it, and there was. I spent a few terms there, and when I was due to go back at about 10 years old, the taxi was waiting outside to take me to Charing Cross Station.
Right.
And I locked myself in the toilet and refused to come out. And my dad was trying to break the door down, but eventually the taxi meter was ticking, and I was allowed not to go back to boarding school, and went to a Jewish primary school called Hasmonean. And how did things develop? When I reached the age of 13, I was quite. I mean, my dad had lost his faith. He couldn't believe there could be a God that could have allowed what had happened to happen. But he still kept a kosher home, and I was into the religion, and I used to go to synagogue every Saturday. And when I turned 13 and had my bar mitzvah, I stopped going to synagogue, and instead I'd fallen in love with the Newcastle United football team, and used to follow them all over the country. And my big hero was a footballer they had called Jackie Milburn, and I also became friendly with the captain of the team, Scottish gentleman called Jimmy Schooler, who used to have a ticket waiting for me when I would arrive at whatever ground, and another footballer called Vic Eborn, who was their centre forward at the time, but lived in Colchester, and I used to share train journeys with Vic Eborn, sort of going up to play in the matches and coming back afterwards, and anyway, I wanted to be a professional footballer.
Well, were you any good, George? Were you any good at playing football?
Yeah, I modelled myself on Newcastle United's left winger, a gentleman called Bobby Mitchell.
Right.
And very one-footed, very left-footed, and I think the name Bobby Dazzler came from Bobby Mitchell.
Okay.
And but anyway, I had trials at QPR and Charlton, but I didn't succeed, basically because I wore spectacles, and instead of becoming a professional footballer, my dad sent me to a diamond setter, and I became apprenticed as a diamond setter.
Whereabouts was that?
Sorry?
Whereabouts was that? Where were you diamond setting?
In Hatton Garden.
Okay, yeah, there's a massive community there, yeah.
Yeah, and I did a 5-year apprenticeship, which was a total waste of time, which ended at the beginning of 1961.
Right.
When I was 21 years old, and I went into my dad's business, And on May the 1st, 1961, my life changed. It is the day that the Harold Macmillan government legalised gambling, and working apprentice. I mean, at the end of my apprenticeship, I was earning £5 a week, and with my dad, I was earning 20 quid a week just starting off. And,
Right.
And I walked into a betting shop. Betting shop opened in Hatton Garden, and I'm looking at the names on the board of a race that's coming up, and my mind focuses on a horse called Only for Life, and I put £1 on it. It was 33 to 1.
Right.
And it won.
The worst thing ever to happen on your first bet, isn't it? Is to actually win.
I was hooked, and
yeah.
Gambling was to get me into a lot of trouble over the years, and love affairs, couple of girls in my life. One I lived with for nearly 4 years, and then when we split up, I moved house. I'd been living in different properties in Hampstead.
What was her name, George? What was the name of that first girlfriend?
Colleen Kendall. She was a beautician who I met in a club called the Cash Door off Finchley Road.
Right.
And as I say, we lived together for nearly 4 years, but it came to an end, and I moved into. I'd been living in a house in Netherhall Gardens called Heartsease. It was the house that was owned by an Austrian actor called Joseph Furst, Furst, and I left there, as I say, when my relationship with Colleen came to an end, and I moved into a mews in Hampstead called Perrin's Walk.
Right.
And I rented I rented the property there, and life went on. And then in 1971, I met the love of my life. She was. I was in a food shop in Hampstead. I bought a packet of plums, and I came out of the food shop, and this very attractive girl was walking past, and I held out my bag of plums and offered her a plum.
Right. Always the charmer, George. Always the charmer.
Sorry?
Always the charmer.
Well, I used to buy bunches of flowers and walk around the streets looking for pretty girls and giving them bunches of flowers, and that's the way I was.
Right.
And anyway, this girl, Penny Mullen, she was the girlfriend at the time of Errol Brown, the hot chocolates.
Oh, right. Good heavens.
And he was living in a penthouse flat that I had lived in years earlier in Hampstead. But anyway, right. I presented myself to Penny as being cool Ovaltine, and I cool Ovaltine won her away
from Errol.
From Errol, yes.
So what did Errol have to say about you and your plums?
no idea. I never spoke to him.
Right.
But our affair lasted for 3.5 years.
Right.
It went sour towards the end. I was out gambling every night at the Claremont Club in Berkeley Square, and I was the last person to play backgammon with Lord Lucan,
Brilliant. Who won? Who won the last game of backgammon? Lord Lucan.
I can't remember.
You can't...
but his mind wasn't on the game. I think I must have won.
Okay.
And I could see that his mind was elsewhere, and I asked. He went off for a toilet break, and I asked one of his associates what the matter with him was, and he told me that the day before he'd gone to Harrods and bought a kitten for his children because he was separated. He was living around the corner somewhere, and the kitten had come back through his letterbox with its throat cut.
Oh my goodness.
And I think that was really the incident that tipped him to go into that direction that he went in. And anyway, so my relationship with Penny had come to an end. I tried to pursue her. I moved. She had gone back to her family home in Dublin. Her family were they were the Maxwell petrol people that had started off selling petrol in Ireland. They made a penny on every gallon that they sold initially. So,
right.
As I say, my girlfriend Penny had been named after that penny.
Oh, is that right? Okay, good heavens.
Yeah, and I pursued moved over to Dublin. This was 1975, towards the end of 1975.
Right.
And I rented a magnificent place there that an American millionaire had bought and was going to redecorate it. His name was Bernard Edson. He was the head of Brothers Sewing Machines and other stuff, and I moved into this house and Stepaside, it was called, in a village just outside Dublin called Stepaside Village. I tried to buy the house, but didn't succeed,
right.
and came back to London about 6 months later, not knowing what to do. Started gambling, got myself into £10,000 worth of debt. My dad had bailed me out of a £10,000 debt years earlier, and it had been quite soul destroying. I just couldn't go through it again, and swallowed a bottle of pills, hoping to leave this world, and woke up with the phone ringing. I answered the phone. It's one of Hatton Garden's shadier characters, and he's never phoned me before, this guy, and he's got these rubies, and he wonders if I can sell them for him and to cut a long story short, within 24 hours, I'd sold the rubies. I'd made the £10,000
Good
that I
heavens.
was in debt, and things developed from there.
Right.
And coincidences started happening that just couldn't be coincidences. And I began to believe that something out there was trying to communicate with me, essentially making things happen in my life. And the last coincidence happened in August 76, where one night, it was around midnight, and I'm trying to call a friend, and I find myself on a crossed line. Do you remember days when you could get a crossed line?
Absolutely. It was extraordinary, wasn't it? You're not quite sure who's listening in. Nowadays, I think anybody can listen to anything. But
I don't know, but the conversation was just starting up.
Yes.
English girl, American guy, he's just flown in. A mutual friend has given him her telephone number, and he's trying to get a date with this girl. And I'm listening to the conversation, and I'm falling in love with this girl. She's got a really nice sense of humour, and he's not getting his dates. But I carry on listening, and their conversation must have gone on for about nearly half an hour. And as it's coming to an end, I try to make my presence known, and I'm too late. She's put the phone down.
Oh no!
And I end up saying a few words to him.
Right.
The next morning, I've got an appointment to meet someone in the coffee shop in the Hilton Hotel in Park Lane, and I'm still thinking about what happened on this cross line. I'm really aggravated that I didn't make my presence known earlier. And anyway, I get to the coffee bar in the Hilton Hotel, and it's quite crowded, and I see a table, and there's two pretty girls sitting at the table, and I sit on the next table, and I'm listening to their conversation, and one of the girls is talking about the conversation that I'd been listening to at midnight. One of the two girls was the girl that had been on the cross line.
Right.
And I introduce myself, and I pretend to be a mystic, and I freak her out because I know so many things that she said in the conversation, and then her friend wants me to demonstrate my powers on her, and I had to tell her the truth.
Oh, you did? You told the truth. What did she say then?
Well, we dated a few times afterwards, but it didn't turn into anything. But that was, as I say, the last big coincidence. There couldn't be coincidence,
Right.
and I'd experienced a whole string of them. And I go to a parapsychology event at the City University. I was going to go there to meet a writer called Colin Wilson. Colin, do you ever hear of Colin Wilson?
Remind me about him.
He wrote a book called The Occult, and he told me he was going to be at this conference, and I arranged to meet him there. And I go to the conference, and it's the summer of '76. It's when there'd been a drought for ages, and what have you. And the first speaker that I tune into. There's a guy he's come over from America. His name is Ted Owens, and he's called the PK man, psychokinesis, and
Right.
claims to be in communication with extraterrestrial intelligences, and that they're using him to control the weather. Essentially, he can apparently forecast lightning to strike specific targets at specific times, and appear to do all sorts of things with the weather. And the day he arrives is the day that the drought ended. It started to rain, essentially. And I never got to speak to Colin Wilson at all, but I became friendly with Ted Owens.
Right.
And
because Colin Wilson was quite prolific writer, wasn't he? I mean, he wrote about all sorts of things like true crime and mysticism and the paranormal. I think he wrote over 100 books, wasn't it? Enormous quantity of work.
I think he's still alive. He lives in Cornwall somewhere.
No, I think he died back in 2013.
Did he?
Yes, sadly, it's all the way back then. So yes, he was 82 then.
Yeah, no, death definitely doesn't sadden me. I mean, my favourite Bible quote is Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 1.
Right.
This is supposedly King Solomon speaking from beyond the grave, and he says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and death than the day of one's birth. I find that the most comforting statement in the Bible, and I do suppose that it's true. And Ecclesiastes is the most revealing book in the Bible. It implies that everything is scripted, everything has a time and a purpose and a season. Like it says, a time for this and a time for that, and significantly for the moment, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. And it also says there's no new thing under the sun. This is a play that we're all being directed to play our scripted parts in. I'm sure of that.
Right.
And anyway, this was all, let's say, back in 75, 76. I'd become friendly with comedian Peter Cook, who'd moved into Perrins Walk just before I left to go to Dublin pursuing Penny.
Right.
And
so Peter was your next door neighbour, is that right?
Three doors.
Okay, that's fairly neighbourly. And how did you first meet Peter?
I met him in the Mews. I had this Labrador dog called Geronimo, and I was just walking out with Geronimo, and he came out of his house, and we got chatting, and I used to call him the wizard, and he had started up his own notional political party, which he called the What Party, and he was getting ministers for his party, and he made me the minister for confusion in the What Party, and told me to go out and cause as much confusion as possible. So,
and were you successful doing that? Were you successful at causing confusion?
Sorry?
Were you successful at causing confusion?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Were you successful at causing confusion? as the minister of confusion?
Sorry, I still didn't.
Oh, that's okay. I was just saying, George, whether you were successful at causing confusion as Peter Cook's minister of confusion.
Well, I was only minister of confusion for a few years. Then Peter referred to me as being after that wicked, because the news of the world had described me as being wicked Weiss, because I was set up to sell a couple of their journalists some LSD, and they made me out to be the master pusher behind the acid house craze, which was nonsense. And anyway, I went to prison for 4.5 months, but I was described as being wicked Weiss, so Peter from then on always referred to me as being wicked. And I used to call Peter the wizard. He was to me the wizard of what, those were the early days. Anyway, in 1976, after almost immediately after meeting Ted Owens, I found myself with 3 other people in my house holding a Ouija session. A girl, model called Kay Winston, she was very into it, and I'd been telling her what had been happening in my life, and I had found myself thinking that a friend of mine who had died a few years earlier was somehow wanting to communicate with me, and anyway, we do this Ouija thing, and tried a couple of times, and they all hold hands, and four of us, and nothing happens, and then a third time, and the glass moves, and it spells out the name David. This was my friend, and David starts to communicate with me, and that was the beginning of a very mystical 6-month trip that I was taken on. And within that trip, I was guided to read the 66 books of the Bible and link them to the 66 chapters in the prophet Isaiah. And theologians agreed that the first 39 chapters in Isaiah were written by one writer, and the last 27 by different writers. And the Old Testament has 39 books in it, and the New Testament has 27 books in it. And I was guided to see the truth that lies behind what can be shown to be mythical stories, especially the story of Jesus, which the first Gospels were written about 40, 50 years after the events were supposed to have happened, which is unbelievable in itself. If those events really had happened, it wouldn't have taken 40, 50 years for someone to have written something about it. And in the first 2 Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as being a false prophet, because he prophesies that he's going to return in great splendor while the generation he's speaking to will still be alive. And I'm saying those Gospels appear when that generation has disappeared essentially. So he is portrayed in those two gospels as being a false prophet. And anyway, as I say, I was guided to see the truth that lies behind what can be shown to be mythical stories quite clearly, and spent 6 years trying to write a book about it, which I never finished, and had moved to Ireland spent over 3 years in Ireland trying to write this book. And while I was in Ireland, I became acquainted with a number of tax exiled writers who were living there, including a writer called Edmund Ward. Did you ever hear of Edmund Ward?
Tell me about Edmund Ward.
Edmund was an ex-priest who became
he was a screenwriter as well, wasn't he? Is that right?
Yeah, he wrote a lot of the James Bond
yes.
Scripts.
And the Professionals as well. He did the Professionals and the Power Game, and I think the Violent Enemy and that sort of thing. And he wrote quite a lot for the ITV Player of the Week. Well, I'll tell you what, George. Let's what we'll do. We'll take a quick break here, and we'll come back and find out a bit more about Edmund George. But in the meantime, George, thank you very much for joining us. Stay on the line.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that's George. We're going to be back with him in the next episode. Do join us. And in the meantime, this is Andrew Eborn for Lockdown London. We're all here. We're all live. I'll be back with George very shortly.